Has anyone here been required to take human trafficking as a requirement to be on a medical staff at a hospital? Raise your hand. How many people in the room think they understand fully why doctors should be taking a course in human trafficking? Show of hands. I see some hands. I see some know-it-alls here in the middle. Okay, I won't put you on the spot, but I will tell you this. Do you remember, for those of you who were awake during my 7:30 presentation, do you remember when I said to you, there's not a lot of ways to jazz up a HIPAA presentation or an end-of-life one? Not so with human trafficking. It's actually a really interesting topic. I was told it was so good last year virtually. I was that good. I was that good last year that I was asked to do this live. So for your viewing pleasure, we are going to talk about a multi-billion-dollar criminal industry in the world that affects you as a doctor and your staff. So interesting. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Nan Gallagher. I'm a healthcare lawyer in New Jersey, licensed in some other states. I serve as general counsel to NJOPS. Thank you to NJOPS and to TIMA and the executive board for having me here. Let's talk about this very serious subject, but it's a very interesting one. I have no conflicts. There's my background. I do a bunch of stuff, but what I mostly do and what we do at the firm, it's a boutique healthcare law firm, we help doctors. We help medical practices. We represent some associations and organized medical staffs at hospitals. So obviously you all are familiar. In order to get CME, you need to understand objectives. These objectives are actually really important. We want you to be able to understand and describe the scope of the human trafficking problem, not only really in the US, but worldwide. We're going to identify approaches that you as physicians can employ to recognize human trafficking victims and certain tactics to help them. And learn how to implement what I consider to be a very multifaceted approach towards human trafficking as a systemic problem. So to empower you to, as a group and as individuals, to help stop the problem. It only takes one person to intervene in the life of a victim to really make a difference. So technically, human trafficking has been defined as the trade of humans for the purpose of forced labor, sexual slavery, or commercial sexual exploitation, right? If you look it up in a textbook or online, that's what it is. But it's a crime against a person, right? That person becomes a commodity. Nearly 80% of human trafficking victims are sexually related. They're forced to have sex, prostitution. 19% of human trafficking victims are used for labor purposes. So the other big percentage is for sexual purposes. An estimated 28 million adults and 16 million children are victims of human trafficking. Look at those numbers. The average age of victims is around 15 to 17 years old. Does anyone have any idea why that is? You don't have to answer. It's because people within that age demographic, they're pubescent or post-pubescent. You're all the doctors, you could tell me that, but they're pubescent, they're quasi-sexual beings, they're young, they're naive, misunderstood, going through hormonal changes, more likely than not to have problems on the home front, fighting with their parents. There's a whole slew of factors that make someone in that demographic more susceptible to influence, to deception, to, hey, if you come with me, I'll give you a better life, or frankly, just to being kidnapped. but that 15 to 17 year bracket is where the average age falls. But make no mistake, human trafficking victims span all ages. There's even human trafficking victims who have been charted to be in their 60s and 70-year-olds. So it's scary. It's a scary thought. Here's some statistics for you. Try to keep your breakfast down. It affects 33 million people worldwide as of 2021. It's the second largest criminal industry worldwide. Second largest, only to drugs. And it's been featured, this topic has been featured on programs. We've seen this recently in Law & Order. There was an episode on Grey's Anatomy, which is really tailored more towards the female demographic 45 and under, but there were some episodes about human trafficking in a hospital setting. It generates billion with a B, dollars per year. And the most commonly affected victims of human trafficking are women and children. We know why. I don't need to explain that. The life expectancy for a victim of human trafficking is about 7 years. How about this statistic? A 2019 study from the Annals of Health Law found that almost 91% of interviewed human trafficking victims or survivors of domestic sex trafficking had encountered one or more health professionals in their scope of trafficking. At some point in time, they were before a healthcare practitioner. 91%. So none of them were identified as victims during these encounters out of that 91%. That's why you're here. You're also here because there's another lecture after mine. But nonetheless, you can do something. I can do something. We all can do something. So if you're more likely than not, or your staff is more likely than not to encounter a victim of human trafficking in the course of being in the hospital, in the course of your private practice, arming yourselves with the classic signs, symptoms, indicators for a victim or their trafficker may help you. So I feel very honored to potentially arm you with some additional information that may help you save a life. That's where non-lawyers can help doctors save lives. But 70% of physicians claimed they would not know what to do if they encountered a human trafficking victim. 70%. So that's why this becomes an important, and I dare say, annual requirement. Now, this came from Physician Weekly in January of this year. These numbers increase. There was from my study of the information, there was a decrease in some human trafficking in the throes of the pandemic. Understandably, less people were out and about, more people were shut in, illness going around. But as we push through this pandemic, these numbers are climbing again. How is sex trafficking or human trafficking done? Well, the victims are tricked very easily. You know, they're promised that better life or told, hey, let me help you immigrate to this country, etc. I'll help you become a citizen. All of the natural inducements that one who is in need might expect. Maybe they're lured with along the same lines, the promise of a job or money, or that there's a better life. There's no negativity if you follow me and follow me to this life, or come live with my family, or come work here in this factory. You'll have a better life, and then you can afford, for example, to bring your family to the United States. There's all of these deceptive inducements. Or they're forced, kidnapped, beaten, raped, etc. What are these victims made to do? Well, most of them are forced into prostitution, whether it's brothels or porn, etc. But some of them are forced into labor, So whether it's a sweatshop, commercial or agricultural settings, any type of childcare, housekeeping venues, etc. So whether it's sexual in nature, and I think from my recollection on your program, this course was described as entitled sex trafficking. But it's really not just sex trafficking, right? We've covered that, but it's a large part of what we're talking about in terms of this global problem. The large part of these victims, by far and wide, out of the pie chart of these victims, most of them are forced into sexual industries. And it's not just the victims that you might have seen on TV or might have read about in a book or an article or might have heard about in a prior, less scintillating lecture on this subject. A lot of individuals who become victims of human trafficking are upper middle class Caucasian females, including in counties in New Jersey that one would never expect for this to occur. Think about that. And be more vigilant, in my opinion, and this is not meant for me to preach at you, but I would encourage you to be more vigilant in looking at articles, resources, social media on these subjects. Listen to stories, listen to patients. I'm not even talking about the indicators, signs, or symptoms of human trafficking. Listen to stories. You may hear from people in normal, everyday parlance that this problem is growing and it's hitting next door, and it is growing. So, victims of human trafficking, here are some conditions that they have to face. Whether they're poorly fed or washed, they've not received medical attention, necessary medical attention, which we'll talk about in a minute. Maybe they've been beaten, raped, intoxicated, or drugged. Perhaps they don't have passports, their passports were confiscated so they can't travel with ease, or they're living in a chronic state of fear, or all of the above. But these conditions are important because they are some of the signs and indicators of a human trafficking victim. Let's just talk about no medical attention for a minute, because this is the start of how this starts to affect you. You may encounter or know colleagues who encounter patients who come to you or come to them who are missing or devoid of very simple, obvious, necessary medical care. I'm sure any one of you could imagine a patient in your office saying, how did they let it get this bad? Why didn't they come to me for this? Or why didn't they go to the urgent care center up the street or an ER? In fact, most human trafficking victims do show up in ERs as opposed to a private practitioner's office. Now, that is not always the case, and you want to know why it's not always the case? Because hospitals are required under New Jersey and other state Department of Health regulations to have annual training on human trafficking, which means that if victims come in with their traffickers, it is more likely and more probable they're going to get caught because they're going to an ER in a hospital regulated by a Department of Health where they have had annual training on this subject. So the likelihood they're going to get flagged is higher. So sometimes they do just call a primary care doctor, an OBGYN, any type of specialist, a family doctor, etc., and say, you know, I need to come in for this. And you may encounter that patient, or your staff may, and they're going to say to themselves, what happened here? They're missing this elemental element of patient care that if the person who's with them, which we'll talk about, I'm going to use the word the trafficker, if the trafficker really cared about them, they would have sought that treatment earlier. So that's a big sign, and that's why doctors should be trained to point out and recognize some of these symptoms. Here's some warning signs. Well, you're going to seek a level of control. The trafficker, and that's the person with the victim, exerts a high level of control over the victim. So whether it's threatening them, isolating them, looking at them, holding their documentation, the person they're with, the family member they're with, holds all the keys to the kingdom. You'll see perhaps the patient is looking to the trafficker or family member for answers. For example, when did you sustain this cut to your leg? And the patient will look and probably not be the one answering. So does anyone have any idea what you would do if you were evaluating, and by the way, this is rhetorical because I'm going to answer myself, but what you would do if you were asking a patient who was old enough about a necessary medical history item or items and they weren't answering, or they were not really sufficiently answering, and they were looking to someone else who you're told is their mother, their cousin, their sister-in-law, their uncle for the answers, and those answers are coming from that person. Do you know what you would do? If that patient was old enough, in your estimation, and you're all smart enough and experienced enough to know that, you should very nicely and respectfully redirect to the patient. If you have to, nicely and respectfully ask the family member to leave. That is easier said than done. Okay, New Jersey, for example, has certain requirements in terms of chaperones being present from the office. So for example, if you're licensed in New Jersey, you are required, as an aside, to have a sign in your office that says chaperones will be made available upon request. You're required to have that. If you're licensed in New Jersey and you don't have a sign, whether it's printed on a 8x10 piece of paper or framed and hung up on your wall, if you don't have that, Monday morning, run to your printer and slap it up on the wall. But there will be instances where a patient or the family member, the trafficker, says, no, I'm going to stay. So I understand and I recognize that there is some level of, yeah, in a perfect world you can ask them to leave, but then the mother gets all upset. But if you feel the patient isn't meaningfully answering you with necessary information and you're getting it from the third source, in one eye start analyzing that third source, that trafficker, that family member, because you don't know. I mean, no one's sitting here saying, aha, I have human trafficking going on. I am going to be the hero of the day. No, it's a judgment call, right? So consider human trafficking, this is my opinion, as a differential diagnosis. It's part of your diagnosis. Like, what's going on here? I'm going to keep this in the back of my head. Let me keep talking. Patient may have signs of distress or injury. We talked about that. So they may be signs that are similar to domestic violence, which isn't human trafficking, but is also something that's part of your differential diagnosis. So this person is injured, but they're looking to the person in control to answer questions, or they've got all the insurance information. They hold the keys to the kingdom. If that is the case for you, one thing that you're considering should be their medical condition. What am I dealing with here? How am I going to treat it? The other thing you should be considering is there domestic violence of sorts going on? Another thing you're going to think of, and it may be fleeting, but I'd love if you'd think about it, is there human trafficking going on? So it's all part of what you're thinking about. And all of these things that you're thinking about, and you're all experienced, these are split-second decisions. These are things that you don't have to sit there and harp on. You're not studying for your boards, but start thinking about it. Also, patient might be confused. Patient might be confused as to simple answers. When did you come to this country? When did you sustain the injury? How long have you been suffering from this? Maybe the patient is confused. How long have you been working here? Patient's not sure. Well, then you throw something else into your differential diagnosis, which might be, do I have drug or alcohol use? Do I have dementia? Do I have a neurological disorder? So all of these things are mixing around in your centrifuge, right? They may not know why they're there, who their friends are. So querying a patient of sufficient age and capacity about things. You know this. What sports do you play? Where do you go to school? Tell me, you have any siblings? What does she like to do? Have a conversation. If you have a conversation with a patient, whether it's domestic violence or human trafficking victim in the end, we find that out later. If you're having a conversation with any patient and they're not able to, they could be shy, but if they're not able to answer fundamental and elemental questions about their lives and the nature of a medical condition or an injury, big indicator in your mind that there's something else going on. Perhaps they're ignorant. So, like I said, they just don't even know fundamental facts about their lives or the lives of others in their circle. You are permitted as a physician to ask questions that go beyond medical care. I am not saying, lift the proverbial hood and start asking them all of these invasive questions that might go beyond a reasonable medical practitioner's conversation to try to assess fundamental components necessary for diagnosis and an assessment of whether there's human trafficking or domestic violence. I mean, don't go all in and offend people. However, you will see if you're ever unlucky enough to be in the situation of treating a patient who is a victim of human trafficking or domestic violence, if their trafficker or abuser is with them, it is often the trafficker or abuser who gets most offended from the questions. So that's another sign. If the trafficker/abuser is mad at certain questions that are non-medical that you're asking, it's an indication that you need to dig a little bit deeper and perhaps ask them to leave the room. And then also their appearance. Many times these types of victims appear destitute, dirty, unwashed, unkempt. So I attached here for you, and I don't expect you to be able to read it from afar, and it's not really the best quality, but I attached for you a human trafficking poster that is required to be posted in every hospital. It comes from the American Hospital Association, and the New Jersey Department of Health mandated a couple of years ago that this has to be somewhere near an ER in every hospital. And it has some of these human trafficking red flags, the ones I'm going over, right? So if you want, and you're looking, you feel so empowered by this scintillating presentation that you're like, I am gonna look at these slides again and again and again for my viewing pleasure. This is one to look at. Or go to the one in your hospital and read it, because these are good red flags to help spot a victim. But having a patient who is concerned about, they don't want to get arrested, oh, if you do this, I'm going to get in trouble. Perhaps they look disheveled, they have poor medical history knowledge, they have an ignored medical condition that the reasonable patient would have come for evaluation sooner. Any of these red flags are triggered, including, for example, a rampant STD or a poor historian concerning sexual encounters, or even a poor historian about an injury or injurious encounter. If you have someone who has crossed your path who has such a severe trauma injury and they're not able to articulate how it developed and it's fresh, well, you might want to rule out some neurological disorders or memory issues, but at the same time, dig a little bit deeper. Other indicators, they may have sustained trauma like broken arms, limbs, noses, etc., bruising, missing teeth, along the lines of teeth, poor dental hygiene. I dare say most human trafficking victims don't have the best smiles. They don't go for necessary dental care. So it's just one factor to factor in. STDs, we talked about, it's one sign. They have substandard mental health. They have a flat affect. You're asking them questions. Yeah. I don't know. Oh, do you like to play soccer? Yeah. All right. Well, you have this bad bruise on your knee. Your kneecap looks busted up. How'd you get that? I don't remember. Or they're looking to the trafficker for the answers. If that patient can talk and they're of the right age, they have capacity, and they're not able to answer your questions, or they have a flat affect, bad teeth, any of these things, and it's not all of them. You could have one symptom. You could have an incredibly hygienic, non-STD, perfectly hair highlighted patient with a severe injury who has great level of medical history knowledge about herself, who's in the porn industry and who was forced to be in that porn industry when she ran away from home to get away from her parents at 16. Okay, so it doesn't always boil down to one sign or one symptom. Typically, they are submissive. And typically, more often than not, they are coming in with the trafficker. So what's being done to help this problem? And I hate to call it a problem because that sounds so woefully passive and apathetic to this crisis. What's being done? Well, we're educating, not just me. Doctors and people are getting educated. There are governmental programs out there, which we're going to talk about a little bit, but there are governmental programs. There's also governmental payments that are being issued to trafficking organizations to free victims. There's also the TVPA, the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, that has a tiered system, basically depending on the number of trafficking victims by a particular trafficker, there's certain levels of violation. This is not enough, but it is at least our federal government's first step at a solution. I don't think it goes anywhere near enough to try to stop this problem. And by the way, the problem can't just be solved by doctors. I'm not trying to say that. You are one in an army of people. I am one in an army of people who could see it and report it. So that statistic that I showed you before, 91% of these victims say they've encountered a doctor or healthcare practitioner in their stint. So you're more likely than I am to encounter these types of victims. And then there's also some nonprofit organizations that are out there. Doctors need to be alert and attentive to these signs and symptoms, like I said. Understand that you have those unique qualifications. So even if what I'm telling you is very commonsensical, right? You've got the access. Patients aren't coming to me for medical treatment. They're coming to you. You're walking through an ER. You might be on call at a hospital on your orthopedic service. It's your weekend to take call. You take call, you're there, you're treating an ankle. But the person in the bay next to you who's being treated by an ER doctor or some other specialist is the victim. Maybe you laid eyes on the victim. Maybe you're within earshot of hearing pretty bad answers to questions, or you're hearing a family member, and by hearing I mean overhearing, a family member give really assertive, dictatorial answers to fundamental questions that the patient should know. Do you think if you overhear that, enough for you to at least have something registering in your mind, do you think that you have an obligation when you overhear that to do something? Yes. Because if you don't, you cannot trust that the doctor in the next bay has the sophistication, guts, training, knowledge, confidence to do it himself or herself. What if it were your child? Right? So understanding that you've got the access and the qualifications. Know how to identify those warning signs that I went through. Don't be afraid to ask those questions, even the ones not about medical care, or isolate the patient from the trafficker. Apply trauma-informed, holistic approach to these patients, because honestly, they're victims. They are victims. So if it becomes abundantly clear to you, and I dare say that doesn't happen often, if it becomes abundantly clear to you, this is exactly what I'm dealing with. Just remember, as much as you want to help the patient, save the patient, get the trafficker in trouble, be a hero. Who doesn't want to be a hero? I want to be a hero. But all of those desires are going through your personal and professional minds. But as much as you want that, as much as you're doing that, at the same time, that's a victim. Whether it's domestic violence or human trafficking, that person may not know anything different. That person may say, wait, this person, this trafficker, you know, my Aunt Millie, she's the person who feeds me. She puts a roof over my head. What are you doing? So you have to treat these individuals very respectfully, carefully, with kid gloves, because you can't just take this nuclear option and scoop the patient up into your arms and let your red cape flow and march them to risk management at the hospital. Just can't do that. It's not practical, and it can have a detrimental psychological effect on the patient. It also can invite a violent act by the trafficker. I'm completely holding that aside. You don't know if this trafficker is armed or psychotic, which I dare say all traffickers are. So you have to be very careful at all times. Collaborate with law enforcement. Every town, municipality, county, and state has resources and readily apparent information and phone numbers, and I have some at the end here, to contact if you feel you as a doctor have encountered a victim of human trafficking. And oh, by the way, you don't have to exercise a duty to step in. First of all, you don't have a duty, a legal duty to step in. I say you should, but if you don't step in and report it and do something, you're not going to get in any trouble. You might have problems sleeping at night with your conscience, but nonetheless, there's no legal duty on your part. But if you don't report it until the patient leaves, because you weren't sure, you were unsteady, that's okay. You had a differential diagnosis going on. You weren't sure, you reported after the fact. You have resources, they're out there. Contact the police. If you're at the hospital, risk management. If you're in your private medical practice and you really have no idea what to do, you can certainly feel free to call someone like me. I'll walk you through it. I'll take it off your plate, and we'll do it together as a team. But don't do nothing. Pardon the double negative. I was an English major. It hurts me to say those double negatives, but don't do nothing. The AMA Code of Medical Ethics offers physicians specific guidance on what to do with human trafficking victims, human trafficking aggressors. If the AMA is offering ethical opinions and guidance on this, it's a matter of prevalent concern for healthcare practitioners. Know the protocols. What do I mean by that? If you're on a hospital, remember I said how many of you were in a hospital medical staff and had to have this training, which was nowhere near as entertaining as this. I understand. I should leave a little hat out. You can throw tips in it. But nonetheless, if you are on staff at a hospital and you've had this training, that hospital, I guarantee, I will bet my law license, has a policy in place, in writing, that you probably don't even know about, or you know it exists, but you don't know what it says, as to what you should do if you encounter, as a physician, a human trafficking victim. Know the protocols. Arm yourselves with that knowledge. And we, professionals, We know how to learn. We know how to study and understand and commit to memory things. Commit that one to memory, because it's the ignorance, and I don't mean that in an insulting way, it's the ignorance of what to do properly that could make or break whether you save that life. So let's not be ignorant, and I don't mean that again in a bad way. Let's be very, very informed on what to do. All those hospitals have policies. Your medical practice should have a policy on human trafficking. If you don't have a policy for your staff to understand and follow on human trafficking, feel free to give me a call. I'll send you one. And make sure your staff knows it. Be emboldened by all that you've learned in terms of policies and your sense of awareness. Let this analysis that I've been talking about guide you when you're seeing patients. Factor it in. And guess what? The statistics say that you are more likely than not to encounter someone you may have already and you didn't know it. Or maybe you did and you didn't do anything about it. Or maybe you encountered a human trafficking victim and you did do something about it. For that, I tip my hat to you. But be emboldened by that. And the next time you're confronted, whether it's directly in front of a patient, or maybe your staff member says, I had a weird encounter at the front desk. Or maybe you've overheard something, like I said, in the ER bays. Be empowered by your ability to make a phone call or to dig a little bit deeper. You have the purest opportunity to recognize these signs. You have the closest access. You're a doctor. You, within certain very specific regulations, I want to be very clear, you have the power to ask a patient to remove or move certain articles of clothing if within the scope of what you're looking for doing. Let me be very clear, I'm not suggesting that you ask all patients to disrobe, but nonetheless, I can't ask clients to disrobe when they come into my office as many times as I've wanted to. But I truly mean, you have the ability to say, you know, please put this examination robe on, if that's what we call them nowadays. You know, I got mine at Prada. But you can say to them, please put this examination robe on, please sit at the table, or, sorry, my examination, I still need to do X, Y, and Z. Please do not go beyond the scope of the examination for which you were approached, okay? That's a whole other lecture on boundaries, which I'm happy to do at AROC 2023. So you do have that purest amount of information and access. I have enclosed here for you another poster, which is for Hospitals Against Violence, which you'll never be able to read from that far, but it does have information on it that I would encourage you to look at the slides from this program, tips and resources on who to call for human trafficking issues and guidance. There's even numbers and links to call and click on to help empower your staff. Your staff should have some training on this. Whether you go back to your office and give them a little training and engagement yourselves, that's fine. Just talk to them about it. Say, this wonderful healthcare lawyer gave me the best lecture of my life, and it wasn't even on medicine. It was on how to spot human trafficking victims. I have included for you here, and they're live links in the slides, different resources here, whether it ranges from the Department of State, an annual Trafficking in Persons report. That's an annual report. It's like 300 pages long on human trafficking. But if you want to read it, because you have all this spare time, you can go to that. The American Hospital Association, also great resource. The U.S. Department of Homeland Security. This issue has been so important that even they have taken a stand on this. And then, as I mentioned before, the AMA. There's even more resources. These are good numbers if you do want to commit them to your phone. There's the DHS-2 ICE number. You can report suspicious criminal activities, including human trafficking. Also, if you want to get help from the National Human Trafficking Hotline, the NHTH, there's information there. You can even text a number and say, help, I need help. As I said, some of these decisions are split second. So you may just have to text. You may have a policy in place with your staff where you see it in your exam room and you have to text your front desk person, call the police. I have human trafficking going on. If anyone's going to ask me before I end, you will not get in trouble legally if you suspect a domestic violence or human trafficking victim and you're wrong. Nobody's going to successfully, they may try to sue you or file a police report against you because you disparage them. Nope, you're a doctor, and within your level of training, knowledge, and reasonable medical judgment, you reached a decision as part of your differential diagnosis that this person is a victim. They were unable to do doot. They had these doot symptoms, and you made a decision which in retrospect you stand behind. You get in trouble, someone comes after you and says, I'm going to sue you. Give me a call, please. I'll fight that any day with pleasure. Oh. 20 years of lecturing, and I got a clap during the lecture. I should drop the mic. And, where's Tima when we're trying to get woohoo! I better see this on social media later. But anyway. It's artificial. All right. Thank you so much. Thank you. This seemed incredibly genuine. Thank you. Thank you. And lastly, as we're ending, Polaris Project. It's an interesting read if you go to polarisproject.org. In addition to services directly to victims of human trafficking, in a bunch of different states as well as DC, they have a 24-hour national service that specifically focuses on empowering and educating doctors and healthcare professionals on spotting human trafficking and doing something about it. So take a look at the Polaris Project. You can register for updates. They'll even send you text messages that another doctor reported that there was human trafficking going on, so you're on alert, right? How many people get a text that says, oh, we're at a fire risk in New Jersey, or, oh, you know, someone's Ring sent you a text message saying there's a bear in the neighborhood. Maybe you want to get a text that says human trafficking victim in the hospital. Be on the lookout. Polaris Project has that resource for you. I will answer any questions if anyone has them. Yes, doctor. You know I'm kidding. Right. Right. That's great. So if for everyone who didn't hear that, because I didn't make you approach the mic, there's different reporting requirements in New Jersey, for example, and in other states for kidnapping, domestic violence, and let's just say human trafficking. Physicians in New Jersey are mandatory reporters for domestic violence and kidnapping takes different forms. Sometimes it's just one parent who's non-custodial brings a child into your office for evaluation and they don't have custody. So both of the kidnapping and domestic violence, you are mandatory reporters. If you don't report when you have full appreciation that there is an ongoing crime going on, or that you suspect one, you as a doctor can face, I'm not saying will face, but you can face scrutiny before the New Jersey Board of Medical Examiners. Human trafficking, there's no such regulation yet. I think that's going to come, whether it comes from the New Jersey Department of Health over hospitals, so they administer hospitals, or it comes from the New Jersey Board of Medical Examiners, which is taking a more prominent focus on sexual conduct, sexual misconduct. I have a feeling that requiring doctors to report on a mandatory basis human trafficking is a natural extension of where the state board is going with its oversight of doctors on things that are not medical in nature. So, doctor, to answer your question, you do not have a mandatory reporting obligation for human trafficking in New Jersey. There are some states where you do. So it's a different beast. I mean, kidnapping is the taking away of someone who is within the custody of another person or custody of themselves. You take them, and it's a felony. Kidnapping is a felony. Human trafficking is not a felony. So kidnapping, and I'm going back to my bar exam days, it's like the taking of an individual against their will, which often is not the case with human trafficking, against their will, and essentially falsely imprisoning them. Human trafficking, for those who appreciate the nuanced difference, is generally done with the person's assent. It's usually not someone walking in to Target getting grabbed and thrown in the back of a car. That does happen, and that is kidnapping, but human trafficking is more often than not, and especially in the eyes of New Jersey state law, more of a crime of deception and luring, and that does not trigger kidnapping under the letter of the law. So if you don't report human trafficking, you're not going to get in any trouble with law enforcement. You might get in trouble with your conscience at night. But if that's all our questions, because I know Dr. Carr is up, and I did not get you out in maybe a little under an hour, because I started late, because you were all taking a break. Thank you for your time today. Enjoy the rest of A-Rock.